When Ibrahim Traoré summoned his closest circle to the heart of Ouagadougou under the cover of night, he already knew the history books would not be kind to hesitation. And so what transpired in that room, undocumented, off-record, yet destined to ripple through a continent, was not merely a political maneuver, but an ideological ignition rooted in centuries of theft, subjugation, and silence. For in that meeting he laid bare not only the skeletal remains of colonial treaties that had disguised extraction as aid, but the classified intelligence showing how Africa's economic arteries were still being siphoned through third-party contracts, debt diplomacy, and militarized development cloaked in humanitarian language. And as Traoré stood, flanked by generals, economists, and emissaries from Mali, Niger, Guinea, and observers from the fringes of a fractured AU, he unveiled a new compact, not of borders but of purpose, declaring the old regional alliances obsolete and pledging the birth of a Sahelian axis founded on sovereignty, natural resource control, and a doctrine of continental self-sufficiency, echoing Nkrumah and Sankara, but armed with data, digital currency plans, agricultural self-reliance blueprints, and hard-won intelligence on how external players had orchestrated coups, financed insurgencies, and leveraged climate policy to freeze local economies while unlocking favorable extraction clauses for multinational conglomerates posing as partners. And as the second wave of the meeting unfurled with the projection of leaked memos from Brussels, Paris, and Washington, showing explicit strategies for maintaining influence through military training programs, cultural NGOs, and foreign debt portfolios, Traoré asked not for applause, but for commitment, and each attendee signed their name not with ink alone, but with actionable pledges. To remove French as the official language by decade's end, to freeze mining operations until renegotiated under joint ownership models, and to institute a Pan-African Security Command Center immune from UN interference, manned by regional forces, trained domestically, and financed through a new gold-backed continental currency whose first minting would occur in Burkina Faso under heavy guard within the year, setting off murmurs not only among allies present, but within embassies abroad, monitoring the meeting's encrypted transmission in growing disbelief. The third movement of the gathering turned toward culture, where Traoré presented a black box, an archival capsule of colonial film reels, confiscated anthropological footage, and thousands of digital files recovered from shuttered French consulates, evidence of a centuries-old epistemic war, where African history was rewritten, masked or erased entirely from global academic databases. He proposed the creation of a new transcontinental university system, independent of former colonial curricula, drawing on oral histories, pre-colonial scientific practices, and Afrocentric frameworks built from the ground up, promising that no child educated under their new system would graduate without understanding the true cost of IMF loans, the mapping of mineral-rich regions prior to discovery, and the false promises of liberalization sold in exchange for generational subjugation. By the time he moved to the fourth stage, military realignment, the room's temperature had shifted from awe to resolve, and blueprints were unrolled showing the creation of the Sahel Defense Corps, a trilateral military pact with Mali and Niger that would nullify external military bases, deploy border surveillance run through non-Western AI systems, and train new officers in what he termed strategic sovereignty, a doctrine blending guerrilla tactics, satellite resilience, cultural literacy, and resistance to economic subversion. And even as international organizations issued stern warnings, leaked footage from the meeting showed Traoré concluding the session with the declaration that the African century would not be negotiated, begged for, or imported. It would be taken, built, defended, and taught, brick by memory-laden brick. Outside, the news hadn't broken yet, but the signals were already vibrating across embassies, think tanks, and intelligence hubs from Pretoria to Beijing to Langley, each recalibrating their strategy sheets under the heading Post-Western Sahel. because they understood what that meeting signified, not just a symbolic shift, but a structurally disruptive model that could spread like fire if not quelled, diplomatically or economically. And soon after, sanctions were hinted, development funds delayed, regional blocs divided. But Traoré's coalition, instead of retreating, doubled down, moving currency reserves to more favorable banking networks, shifting energy deals toward non-Western partners, and weaponizing social media with a wave of digital storytellers and truth memes that reframed African struggle not as victimhood, but resistance against systemic erasure. The final pulse of the meeting came not with a signature or speech, but with the handover of a single hard drive containing 3 terabytes of classified correspondence, digitized treaties, satellite photos, and internal UN memoranda that showed decades of manipulation, displacement algorithms disguised as humanitarian planning, and detailed blueprints of every extraction site from uranium in Arlit to lithium in Zimbabwe. Evidence that would go on to inform lawsuits, spark mass movements in universities across Africa, and trigger referenda in regions previously too fractured to organize, and even as his critics called him a strongman in revolutionary clothing, it became impossible to ignore that the post-colonial status quo was burning under the weight of that meeting's aftermath. In the weeks that followed, cities erupted not in chaos but clarity. Youth-led forums formed across Dakar, Accra, Kinshasa, and even Johannesburg, where opposition parties borrowed Traoré's language without attribution, eager to ride the surge of newly awakened political awareness. Digital archives popped up from Lagos to Addis Ababa, releasing translated versions of the meeting's contents, and while Western media debated whether Traoré was becoming another populist despot or merely the next domino in a line of civilian governance collapses, many on the ground felt the winds shift. From passive petition to direct coordination, from protest to program, particularly among the rural poor, the borderland farmers, and the dispossessed miners who saw in the new alliance not utopia but leverage. Even artists, filmmakers, and musicians joined the wave, composing symphonies of dissent and revival that carried the names of villages erased by imperial mapping, while across radio waves and shortwave transmissions came voices long buried. Elders, recounting anti-colonial battles once redacted, local languages being revived in formal policy, and museums returning looted artifacts under bilateral pressure not from international courts, but from homegrown civic demand. And in the quiet corners of the Global North's policy rooms, as analysts reviewed the cascade of changes now sweeping not just the Sahel, but the wider continent, some admitted, if only in hushed tones, that Traoré had triggered something irreversible, not just a meeting that changed Africa forever, but a memory reawakened, a map redrawn from below, and a message coded in every beat of the drums echoing from Burkina Faso's soil, that the age of extraction had met the age of reckoning. Let me know if you want a voiceover script, screen adaptation, or a translation into another language, French, Arabic, Hausa, etc.